All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Who are you? Have we met before? If not, welcome, come on in, make yourself comfortable. Everyone else, what's up? How are we doing? How are we feeling today? I hope this finds you in an okay moment. I mentioned last week that I finally wrote a blog post. Some of you listening to this might not know that before this show existed, before I had a weekly podcast that I've done for the last 7 years, this month, August, marks 7 years since I started this show, y'all. August 2015 was when the first episode posted. In any case, before I started doing this 7 years ago, it was just a monthly blog post that I put out. And I think a lot of the people who read the blog post, because I wrote blogs over the last 7 years, only up until this last year did I not keep it going. I haven't written anything for the last 6 months because, well, it's hard to answer. It's hard to say why. You know, the writing process is different than this process of doing the podcast. And I've written several things actually in the last 6 months, but I didn't share them with anybody because it wasn't feeling right. Oh God, see, I can't even talk about it. It's very political. You see, the things that I've written in the last few months have been political, and I didn't want to put that out there. I didn't want to put political stuff out there. So in any case, the reason I'm bringing it up is for those of you who didn't know, before this podcast happened, there was a blog only. And then the blog's been by the wayside some, and I finally wrote a blog in which I talked about my daughter, what's been happening with her, as well as some other stuff. And I realized there's all these people on the email list who don't listen to the podcast and were not aware of any of the stuff that's been going on. So I got a lot of emails from a lot of old friends, which was really nice, actually. And if you haven't read it, you might go to the website and read the new blog. It's called Do You Believe in Spirit? And more than just talking about what's been happening with my daughter, I think for me, it had to do with the limitations of what our Western medicine can do for us. And how more than ever in my life, I feel a need to acknowledge a higher power. Because I'm a couple months into following the recommendations for how to treat my daughter's condition as it's been classified and diagnosed. And as I wrote in the blog, I'm incredibly grateful for the lens. You know, those of you who know me for a long time know I would not normally want to reduce someone's experience to a clinical diagnosis, but when you have no idea what's going on or how to make sense of it, that lens of diagnosis, as reductionist as it may be, it's helpful. And I'm grateful, and as I mentioned last week, there's a lot of things that have gotten a little bit better. There's still some discouraging signs, but at the same time, it's really impossible to know what exactly is helping and what isn't. You know, this term that we have, evidence-based medicine, and I've heard that term applied to yoga therapy a lot as well, evidence-based yoga therapy. Well, I don't know, when you really look into what that means, what the evidence actually is by which some of these protocols and treatments are offered, it's really slim. And in a way, it really boils down to belief systems. That if you believe it, then you give it the chance to work. But it's not as like clean cut as evidence-based means science has proved it true. I mean, even just this week, I don't even know what to make of it, but this landmark study came out on antidepressant medication. And basically the whole premise under which we have these protocols for antidepressant medications to help people with their depression, it's based on a premise that depression is a chemical imbalance, and that if you can regulate serotonin uptake, then you can treat depression. And essentially, they found that it's not true. It's not this chemical imbalance, and it all boils down to serotonin, which we knew. That's why all the placebo studies said that. Remember, I can't remember her name, and I had a researcher on not too long ago. We talked about SSRI and placebo, and what do you make of that? What are you supposed to make of that? I'm not denying that people haven't been helped in some way by taking these medications. And, ostensibly it would seem on the face of it that my own daughter has benefited from taking them. But I don't really know. I don't really know if that's why. I mean, maybe. It's impossible to know. And I will say this other thing. The other part of the treatments that is recommended for my daughter, other than some medication, is that she has this CBT therapy, this exposure therapy, which in theory sounds great. Like when you read about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But when you actually look at what it is, like what cognitive behavioral therapy really is, and then apply that to like the mind of a 7-year-old, I don't know, y'all. I mean, I don't really sure that's helping her right now. So the point of the blog is that at some point I have to find guidance, or I have to find a place to make decisions from that isn't solely relying upon what the doctors are saying. Like you literally can't rely solely on what they say, because they can only say what they have to offer you. And they're all earnest, great people. She has good doctors right now. I'm grateful. It's like a grace that's happened that we were able to find doctors for her, because so few people can right now. There are massive wait lists. Psychiatrists are not accepting new patients. It's not good out there to find care for a lot of people. So we're blessed that we found care. But even with that, even when you get the care, you have to draw upon sources of strength, and guidance is the only word I can think of that aren't coming from the medical establishment. They got to come from somewhere within you. So that's what the blog was about, the questioning that I've been doing. And you've heard me talking about it on this show. Like everybody who comes on, I'm talking about it some, even a little bit today. But I think for me, it really boils down to what today's episode is about. It boils down to discernment. And I think that yoga practice, in a way, is designed to encourage or facilitate discernment, where you can know for yourself from within. So for whatever that's worth, I encourage you to go check out the blog. It's called Do You Believe in Spirit? It's on the website. You can go read something if you want. And as I mentioned, we are talking about discernment today with my dear friend, Alma Duran. And Alma, she's been mentioned a bunch of times on the show. You've heard her mentioned because she's been responsible for many a fine guests, because she's someone who is in my teacher's class for many years since it began, and I've had an ongoing dialogue and relationship with her. She's currently doing my year-long teacher training, and I just felt like it was time for me to bring Alma on the show, because she's been helping me and I've been benefiting so much and learning from her. I felt like you should too. And I really just wanted to honor and kind of celebrate what she's brought to the inquiry that I'm engaging in and to this show. So it was just wonderful to have a moment to capture a little bit of our inquiry together, and to share it with you today brings me a great deal of joy. Real quick, before we get to it though, I want to express gratitude to Podcast Premium subscribers. Specifically today, I want to say thanks to David Singleton and Barbara Fry. Look at that. I know both of those names. David, you're in Australia and you sent me an email a while back, a couple years ago maybe. I don't know. I remember getting an email at an important moment from David. Shout out to you, David. And then Barbara's an old friend from what feels like another lifetime ago, but thanks so much, David and Barbara. Just lovely to see your names come up. And I just appreciate you continuing to support me in the show. If you're new around here and you didn't know, the most recent 52 episodes are always available on the public feed. We also have a premium subscription where you can access the full archives. And really, that's the way that if someone wants to support this show, we don't have like a Patreon or other things, that we just do the subscription. It's a choose your rate and you can cancel at any time. And actually, if you don't have any money, you want to get to the old episodes, all you do is email us and we send you a free account. But if you have even just a little something to give, it makes a difference. We're very grateful to people who do that. And if you want to learn more about how to become a podcast premium subscriber or find out about any of my stuff, my ongoing live stream classes, the weekly teacher's call, all of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I think that's fine. I will leave it there and I'll touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and we'll listen to this conversation that I had with the one and only Alma Duran. Hello?
Hello, Jay.
Hi, Alma.
How are you?
I'm doing good, all things considered. Today's been a really easy day so far, so I've had some good energy leading up to sitting here and hitting go to talk to you today.
Wonderful. I can say the same on this side. It's been a quiet morning, and I always welcome that. That's not always the case, no?
No, not always. So sometimes I have to try to have one of these conversations after a not good morning, and that's way more challenging. But, you know, it's interesting. It's so fun. I'm glad to have this moment with you, Alma, on so many levels. And you know that I'm already recording and that we already started, right?
Sure.
You've listened to the show forever and you know me. So you know we already just started. I'm just going to say in case.
It's okay.
And
it's fine.
Well, you know, I was just thinking about it because on some level it feels really easy because I've known you for years. We've had in-depth conversations about yoga at least, I don't know, maybe 100 times, literally at this point.
Yeah, you're right.
And so I have this comfortability and a friendship with you already. And at the same time, you know, for me, you're also somebody who, and I'm sure you've had this experience too. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this who are teachers have had this experience where people talk about how, you know, your students become your teachers or whatever, like you learn something from your students. And there is that. But then there's something that happens where somebody comes into your sphere as a teacher who, it's a different story in the sense that that person is also a teacher very often, and that person kind of matches you and then some, and makes you a better teacher.
Yeah.
And I feel that way about you. And you know, even the people listening to this show right now, your name has been mentioned so many times because like in the last few months, there's been at least a half dozen guests where I say, oh, I was in my teacher's class and I asked anybody if they knew anybody, and Alma, you know, Monica Voss and Indu Aurora and like all these wonderful guests were because when I was in the teacher's call and I brought it up, you're like, Jay, you should check this person out. So it seemed only fitting to me that you should be here and we should have a talk for the show as well. And it's just, I'm so grateful to you. Even now you're in the training. It's like, it's very affirming. I feel like you really understand what I'm doing as a teacher. And you don't always get that feeling from people who like are practicing or studying with you. And I feel like even in the more recent, months, like the last 7 months in the training, sometimes like even recently in a meeting, you could kind of see things coming together for people in the group, And I could see it in your face. Like your face was like lighting up in the same way that my heart was. And I feel like you and I share this passion. And yet we come from so completely different backgrounds. You know what I mean? Like, I find that amazing. So all of that's an introduction to just say thank you for being my friend and for engaging in study with me. And I'm just appreciative to have this time. Thank you for everything.
Oh, Jay, I'm the one who is so grateful to you because it's been actually since 2016. That's when our paths crossed. That I learned so much from you, and that I feel so supported and so guided and so challenged at the same time. And I'm really humbled that you invited me to have this conversation. My heart feels very open. I think it's a blessing that we get to spend a little time together and talk. Because you're right, we have different backgrounds, but I think there's many different points where there are some similarities in our pathways in terms of what the experiences meant for us and how they change our yogic paths or how they guided us.
Yeah, it seems like that. There's been a lot of parallels. And I didn't even realize it was as early as 2016. When did you've got to forgive me. I'm not sure I remember when our paths first crossed. Do you?
Yeah. You cannot remember that because the way I found you is that I listened to your podcast.
Okay.
That's how it started. And then at a certain point you have the Gentle is the New Advance program. You made that available, and I took that one online. And then when you started the Teacher Sangha, I joined.
Yes, right at the beginning, if I recall.
Right at the beginning. And now that you offer the 500, I thought, okay, I'm going to take the 500 because I'm a lifelong student. So I thought I'm going to do that too. So yeah, it's actually since 2016, Jay.
Wow. I mean, I know people listening to this know what a value it is to have somebody continue over that much time. I mean, it's a lot of years to just continually be touching base and learning from each other. So it's such a rewarding exchange. And I was thinking about what you just said about the parallels. And I was remembering some things about you that certainly did parallel, even in terms of our early beginnings in yoga. I know that you were on the West Coast. I was here on the East Coast, but you stumbled into Yogaworks, the earliest Yogaworks on Montana Avenue, if I recall, right? Mati is Rati. Is that I remember that correctly?
That's right. Actually, I had met Maddie before because Maddie used to work at the Larchmont Center for yoga, the Center for Yoga in Larchmont. And that's actually where I sort of began becoming interested in yoga. And then in probably in the 80s is that they moved to Montana. But that was the time when I was traveling a lot internationally. So it was actually in the 90s when I began going to Montana Avenue. Sometimes with Maddie, sometimes with Larry Payne, who also has been a great influence for me, continues to be until our days. And with other wonderful teachers who've given me so much, like Eric Schiffman. That was a completely different experience too. No? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I remember Yogaworks when it was small and cozy and welcoming and authentic.
All those teachers. I remember when Max Strom came on. He was around there at that time too. And he was talking about that scene there. And that was right at the same time as, Jiva Mukti was on 2nd Avenue.
Yeah.
And there was like the whole New York scene happening. And there was like an East Coast, West Coast. And I remember Sean Korn talked about going from the East Coast to the West Coast. She migrated over. But it was a similar kind of, I don't know, very exciting time, because yoga was so new, it wasn't mainstream. And the teachers were really, like you said, there was something cozy about it. I don't know, there wasn't 200-hour trainings yet. And it still was really rooted in the teachers. They'd gone to India and they were really delving into, what do you call it? The more subtle aspects of yoga, like it hadn't become fitness yet.
You know, what I felt going to Yogaworks at that time is that they all had this space to teach and to practice what they thought was valuable. There were no guidelines or no impositions in terms of what they had to teach. So you had a large variety of styles and approaches, and I really value that.
I think I, like you, in seeing that, sort of embarked upon a bit of like a comparative analysis. And I found like one of my early teachers, Alison West, that's what she had kind of done as well. She had studied like a bunch of she'd studied it both beginning and advanced Shivananda. She had studied with the Iyengar. She had studied with Patavi Joyce. And she was kind of presenting kind of like, this is what this school does and this is what this school does. And kind of, it was she had come from an art history background. And so she kind of had a kind of a lens of looking at the different schools and systems that wasn't like you just give yourself over to one guru kind of thing. It was a more comparative analysis. And it seemed like you had that kind of approach too, even taking it into kind of your cultural anthropology studies, because you did go on to study cultural anthropology, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Right. That happened a little later.
The cultural anthropology.
The cultural anthropology, yeah. At the time when I was in the U.S., I was working in the media. I was a film and television producer. I went to UCLA. Okay. And then I worked there in the U.S. for many years. Well, let's say I worked in the U.S. because that was my base. But I was flying wherever they sent me to produce, no? So it was, at the same time, a really widening experience in terms not only of what I was doing professionally, but also of my experience of yoga, because I basically carried my mat and went everywhere and practiced everywhere I was. So I didn't even think too much, I would just get to the hotel where we were and say, okay, so where's the closest yoga studio? What class can I accommodate in my schedule? And I would just go and see what happened. That was one way in which I approached yoga at that time. The other one is that I had my personal practice. I was fortunate enough to come into yoga through books. And I think that led me to be somehow independent and curious. So I had my own practice, and I could just practice whenever I could not fit something into my schedule or find a studio.
Right, Richard Hittleman, right? You were a Richard Hittleman person, if I remember you saying that in a teacher's class, right?
Yes, it was this 28 days to whatever, I don't remember the full title. Yes. But that was a little hard for me, actually. That was a little hard for me.
You didn't stick to it, but you went off.
No, but then in Argentina, this happened in Buenos Aires, it was also in the 80s, I ran into the books of Indra Devi. And that was more appealing to me. I didn't know at that time. I didn't have the context, Jay, to say
just random books. Yeah, you don't know.
Yeah, whatever crossed my path, basically, So, but I knew what felt right and what didn't feel right. And probably this is because I had, as part of my background, training as a dancer. So I danced classical dance when I was a child. I didn't like it because I thought what I was doing was not feeling right. And I was hurting my body. And then I switched to modern dance. So I sort of got a sense of what felt right and what didn't feel right. And that helped me. I think in a way that protected me from many injuries. Although I had already by this time, by the 80s, I already had several injuries that came from dancing. Mm-hmm. And I had to deprogram myself because in order to practice dance, I never wanted to be a professional dancer or anything like that. It was just fun. But in order to dance, you have to overcome pain and you have to force the body. So I had to undo all that.
Yeah, and then you said your first yoga was at that Larchmont yoga center. Was that with Mati? Was she doing what was she doing at that time as a teacher?
Well, no. I never took one of the classes with her.
Okay.
I just saw her there, and I knew that she was managing the center in the same way that I saw Ganga White and all those guys that now I value so much. But at the time, I didn't have the context to understand who they were or what their teachings were. I was just going to beginners classes.
I see. I'm asking because depending on when in the evolution of yoga we're talking about, because I know at some point yoga classes were doing a similar thing in terms of pushing and forcing the body and overcoming pain. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, did you start out in this more I guess you're saying you already had your own kind of barometer to individualize things and not push too hard?
Right. So when I went into classes that were not what I needed, I will just do it my way or even get out of the class if I didn't think it was right for me. Mm. Otherwise, I started gravitating towards classes that felt better for me.
Right.
That were more gentle, that were more about getting in contact with myself, or practicing at home.
Right.
So that was very useful.
You would be attracted to Eric Schiffman. And then I know Fred Miller was a huge influence on you. And I've been in touch with Fred. He's supposed to come on. We haven't made it happen yet. But when did that happen? When did you meet Fred?
Also in the 80s. It was also in the 80s. Fred really became like my teacher when I was in LA because we have so much in common. Besides the yoga practice, Fred meant for me that a sense of sanity was possible in that crazy industry in which we were. He also worked in the film industry.
Is that how you met him? Is that how you knew him?
No, I met him as a yoga teacher.
Even though he was also in the film industry.
Right. Yeah, and then we worked a couple of times together, and just the way he conducted himself was so calming and so soothing and so balancing that he taught me without saying, hey, look at what I'm doing. He taught me how to practice in daily life, even in your professional life. And he taught me with his example that you always have choices. Even in that industry, you can choose, I do this, but I don't do that. Or engage myself in this way, or this is my attitude towards these things or others. And Fred also helped me because that was the first time that I had a teacher that I could practice individually with. So the practices that he did for me is actually would accompany me as I was traveling all over the world. And there were the teachings of Desikachar.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We both landed there, didn't we? Because you can rely on it for that reason. It's that personal practice component, isn't it?
Right. And this portability, I was looking for that. No? So in a way, since that time, yoga became my anchor. So it didn't matter where I was or how crazy life was or whatever. I could always find a way to come back to a little bit of peace, a little bit of serenity through my practice. And I think that's what saved me.
Yeah, I hear you. And I'm curious, so you got to sort of study with Fred one-to-one and then work with him on a film and see him in not in a yoga context, but in that other context? Is that
we didn't work on a film. We worked on some There was some advertising we did.
Okay.
I was a producer on the side of the agency, and I suggested him for to the production company, and they love him.
Yeah.
So they love him because you really need people like that in the middle of that craziness.
I mean, I love that because I've often said to people, like in terms of choosing teachers, that like the best way to determine like whether or not you feel someone is a teacher for you is often to be able to interact with them, not in the practice space, but like just out in life and see how they are, go out to dinner and see how they treat the waiter or the waitress or whatever,
right.
And sort of see them in like context as a person. And because that's, like you said, very affirming. You can see the characteristics in them that you would hope to also have or whatever, and that's kind of that's often the teaching. Like you said, he modeled something for you in that context where you actually probably learned quite a bit about yoga just from seeing him even in that other context.
And also Fred is someone who is so humble and he knows so much. So that's something that touched me until our days. I learned so much from Fred. I love him.
Yes. There's that one-to-one friendship thing is pretty deep, and that's a lot of where the like transmission or whatever comes from.
And I remember that he told me, because we talked a lot about what it meant to work in that industry, and he told me, or maybe he warned me in a very sweet, understated way, that the practice, when you practice not only at the physical level, but when you let the practice really go deeper, can change you. And maybe at the beginning I didn't really pay enough attention.
You can't hear it at that point, but it happens, right? Because it certainly seemed like that what happened for you, and you did make a big change there for a while. I know you had to move to Germany, if I remember correctly, right?
Well, first I started seeing a huge incongruence or inconsistency between what I was doing for a living and what my inner being was telling me I should be doing.
That's what he was warning you about, probably, right? Like that.
I know, but he did it in such a subtle way,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't regret it. The years that I worked in the industry, it was very exciting in the sense that I traveled so much. I worked with some of the most interesting creative minds that I have run into. I especially enjoy working with directors and music producers. They can be lots of fun. But on the other hand, it's not really what I wanted to do. So at the same time that I was interested in changing what I was doing with my life is when I moved to Germany, and this is because my husband is German. And it was easier for me to move there than for him to be in the US. And when I went to Germany, my intention was I actually had a contract with a company. So I was going to continue producing more documentaries than commercials, because that's actually what I was interested in. I just had to learn a little bit of German, and I thought, piece of cake, Of course, big mistake of mine. Not because, German is challenging, and I had to learn it as an adult, but I didn't consider that there's many unforeseeable things that can happen, and the Twin Towers happened. When that happened, I got a call from the production company and said, we know that we have a contract with you, but all our work internationally has stopped, and we have to put a break on this, which I understand. The world stood on its head, so of course I understood. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to do my PhD, And I originally thought I was going to work on film, maybe on the films of Wim Wenders, someone that I admire so much. Then things change again. I heard a migration story from some people, and that completely changed my focus. So I ended up doing my PhD in Germany, working for a German university, which was a wonderful experience. But doing the PhD in cultural anthropology and specializing in migration. Why in migration? Because I think migration is the history of humanity. Everything migrates, not only people. Music migrates, food migrates, ideas migrate. Yoga migrated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Yoga migrated and continues to migrate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the change that I wanted actually happened. Not in the smooth way that I would have liked it, but it happened. Yeah.
So you studied cultural anthropology and got your degree in that, and then if I recall, you were doing some teaching in that too, and kind of lived in the academic world for a while.
Yeah, since 2000, basically. All of this was happening at the same time that I was practicing yoga, and I was teaching a little bit of yoga because, of course, having the kind of work that I had all the time, either in the film industry or in the academic world, I couldn't commit to like weekly things or anything like that. So it was mostly like friends or people I knew or were referred to me because they wanted a practice that they could take with them. And since I knew what it was to practice in a way that you have to balance your daily life and your commitments with a yoga practice, I guess I had something to offer. And I did all that at the same time. So everything sort of weaves, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was in the academic world, until 2016, basically, when we moved to Mexico.
So what prompted that?
Well, my husband. love. Yeah. The old story. My husband is in love with Maya ruins. That happened way before he met me. So when he could retire from his work, he was the co-editor of a newspaper in Germany. He wanted to dedicate some time to continue exploring Maya ruins here without all the preparation that you need to do when you only come for a season. He wanted just to wake up, take his truck, and go to the jungle. Mm-hmm. And we could do it. We were in a position that we could do that. So I said, okay, let's do it. And I said, that's fine. I have to quit my job, but it doesn't matter. I've done it several times. I'll do it again. Yeah. That's life, And that's when I had the blessing of saying, okay, then I'm just going to dedicate myself to yoga. Now is the time. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's so interesting to hear that part about going from like the academic bubble to like getting in your truck and going to the ruins. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like I've heard you talk a little bit about that, because often when I'm in the teacher's call, because I'm not an academic and I'm trying to talk about, we've been examining all this history and philosophy, and your studies into migration and cultural anthropology always offers this fantastic perspective on that. And whenever we're talking about that, there's always kind of like an academic consideration of certain things. And then there's sort of this embodied experience of things that sometimes they're pointing to in those writing or whatever. And it's an interesting contrast, and that's what I think like the scholar practitioner idea comes from, that they're not exclusive, and they can feed each other. But I suppose if it's just in a scholarly bubble, you don't always get that same embodied experience of things.
Yeah, for me, they go together. I weave them together, because even if you just say that you want to practice yoga, you need discernment to do that. And you need to be able not to get too attached to something specific, because you might be missing other options.
Mm-hmm.
So even for practicing, you need to have that curiosity and that spirit that it's seeking and it's open. I think they go together in a way.
And that I've often talked about that. We talked about that curiosity and like sense of awe and space of practice. And I guess I'm just thinking about how I said earlier how we come from these totally different backgrounds, but we both seem to have landed on like the same song. And that it seems to be, for me, what it has to do with, and I'm kind of curious to hear your take on it, is that it has to do with kind of an understanding about like the integrated nature of practice into your life. And that something about the way like the modern yoga group classes, like the vinyasa yoga classes and all the images of yoga poses, and when yoga went mainstream, everything became kind of this abstracted thing that wasn't so integrated, like you and Fred just hanging out and him giving you some practices to do and you having that wherever you went. It seemed to me like that's the element, the interpersonal exchange and kind of one-to-one nature, even when you're trying to work with people in groups, that is different about like the Desikachar teachings, at least for me. And I'm curious in comparing all these, because you have like certificates and all these different trainings more than me. What is it about like Desikachar teachings for you that is why you, as said earlier, is sort of like where you live in a certain way?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's what felt right. And by that I mean what helps me is the practice in this lineage is what helps me to find that place in myself where I can rest, where I feel more stable, more grounded. I did try many vinyasa and ashtanga things, of course. Being in LA, you had that, especially in the 90s. Yeah, a nice sweat, but it didn't feel so good. But I was thinking, hearing you, how you posed the question, I was thinking that even the group classes in the 80s were different, Jay. To start with, there were 90 minutes. Or maybe
sometimes an hour and 45, if I recall. Yeah.
Or even 2 hours, right?
Yeah, I remember.
Right.
When I first went to Jiva, it was an hour and 45, definitely.
Yeah. We had some classes where, or attended some classes where you came in and there was chanting for 10 minutes or 15 minutes before you started to move. So that creates right away a complete different atmosphere. You're departing from a complete different point when you start that way. Then Shavasana was really long.
Yeah. They would time them for 15 minutes or so, and people would be fidgety, but you would be there. Yes, I remember that too.
And then after Shavasana, in some classes, you have meditation, pranayama and meditation.
Yeah.
So it was something completely different. And you also got much more from the teachers in terms of explaining why are we doing this, or not necessarily what to look for, because this invitational language was not popular at that time.
No invitational language back then.
No, not that I recall, let's say, because of course my memory can be flawed.
Yeah.
But at least what you got was more of an experience that they share with you what had worked for them. They gave you some insights, what to look for. It was much more pause and much more reflective.
Yeah, and I found it, I remember, I wasn't in the 80s, but even in the early 90s when I started still, they just felt like there was more education in the classes. So more of what we consider yoga teacher training now was just the material of the yoga classes that you went to. And if you went to them, you would learn about sutras and you learn about all kinds of stuff if you went to class.
Right. That happened to me in the 80s.
Yeah.
I think in the 90s is when it started changing.
Yeah.
And all that philosophical component, for example, that you got in the 80s is not there anymore by the 90s. It starts turning into more physical, with nice breathing, if you are lucky enough to find a teacher that really guides you in that direction. Otherwise, it turns into something physical or even choreographed. That's when it started to.
Yeah. And I guess there's definitely like a before and after the internet too, for sure. But even before, you would have like the DVDs or whatever, and there'd be the picture, the gloss. Everybody had a gloss picture of them doing a flash pose at some point. And now everybody's like taking it down off their websites and is embarrassed by it. But everybody's got one somewhere of themselves doing some big flash pose, you know?
Yeah, I remember all those videos too. Of course, Rodney Yee and Patricia Val and all that. Yeah, of course, I remember that. I didn't let them influence me too much.
Yeah.
I was using them just, let's say, I was taking all that like a proposal, let's say. It's something that they were doing.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.